life is so much more than thinking correctly. We're moving about. We are people that live in a real, tangible world, and it matters what we do. It matters how we behave. It matters how we treat our bodies. It matters, what we put on and how we speak and all the things, that we are three-dimensional and then some.
Well, hello and welcome back to The Commonplace. My name is Autumn, and we are continuing with our 4th season, Storied Souls, and we're asking another question. But we're going to flip things today because most of our questions have been about the things we take in. And today we're going to look at the other side about how we embody, how we act out story, specifically how our practices shape the stories we tell ourselves about God and about our lives. And so our special guest to help us explore this is the lovely Tsh Oxenreider. Tsh, hello and welcome to The Commonplace.
Hello, Autumn. Nice to be here at your Commonplace.
Yes, it's very funny. So thanks to the algorithms, I think for me it was podcast, for you it was YouTube. Tsh and I came across each other's work in about the last year and a half-ish. And we just somehow have found the other person who's thinking the same ideas and reading the same books just in another part of the country. And it was so funny because your old podcast, which is how I first found you, was through The Good List, right?
Yep.
And you just switched over to A Drink with a Friend as I was discovering The Good List. But
That's
I
funny.
would try to relay things to my husband because I loved it. It was like, this is an idea, this is a habit. And it was, a one-woman show. And I loved it. And I would have to refer to you as the Catholic me for him to remember who I was speaking. And I just kept being like, it's like me. And then it was like, well, she's like the Catholic me. And it just kept and so
That's
when
really funny.
Yeah, when I finally went to your website, for those who don't know, Tsh has an amazing Substack called The Commonplace. And so we came full circle. And so it's a very happy thing for me to welcome you to The Commonplace after learning so much over at your The Commonplace.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm really, really happy to have you here. So listener, if you enjoy the things I talk about, you 100% would enjoy the things over at Tsh's The Commonplace. And it is not like focused in on education and homeschool moms the way I do. It applies these things to persons. And I'm hearing from many of you that you would like to talk about these ideas in a broader context. And so let me push you over to Tsh. And since I'm talking about your work, I would love for you to go ahead and introduce yourself. Just tell us a little about you, what you do, and how you came through the classical wardrobe.
I am a mom, first and foremost, to 3 teenagers, adolescents, which is wild to me. So, kind of full compliment back to you. I refer to you as the person that I wish I was friends with like 10 years ago, maybe, because I think your kids are maybe about 10 years older than me or 10 years younger than mine. So my youngest is 13 now. And then I've got an oldest in college. And I've got a girl, boy, which is what I think you have too. So
yes, it is.
Oldest girl. Yeah. So anyway, so first and foremost, wife and mom. I also teach. I teach humanities, and it's in the context of classical homeschooling education. And I write. So my main gig, I feel like, aside from being a wife and mom, is writer. So I write books. I write, as you said, the newsletter. But I also lead pilgrimages in the summer. So I kind of do a variety of things. But all of those, I feel like, point to my work as a writer. And then that, of course, points to my role here at home, first and foremost. So that's the gist. Those are the hats I wear.
Yeah, those are great. How did you wander into the classical world? Because I could even tell from The Good List, like you had to be a classical educator, just by the way you were talking about the world. I'd love to know how you came in.
Yeah. So back in the day, so this is actually my pre-Catholic day, but I was raised in an evangelical home. I had always loved English. I went to a public high school. And so that was always my favorite class. I just loved reading. And there was something about just storytelling that drew me in. I remember writing stories in 6th grade, writing stories all the way through high school, and then just loving to read them. That really captured my imagination. So I majored in college, but I went to a state school. I went to the University of Texas, which was decidedly not classical at all. And I did my, my just standard liberal arts, in quotes, degree at UT. And I really grew, disillusioned is too strong a word because that makes it sound like I had some kind of agenda. I really didn't. I just burned out. It felt very forced. It felt very like, what is the telos of us reading these stories and writing random papers? So it never felt like there was this end pursuit of virtue. It was just like to get a degree. So by then I had burned out on the thing. I didn't really think I would do much with an English degree. So I ended up going overseas for a while. I traveled and I served in a mission field context. And that's actually where I met my husband, Kyle. We met in Kosovo. And in that time, I was living above a family of Americans, and my roommate was their teacher, and they homeschooled. And it gave me a little taste of what it looked like to maybe, I mean, I got kind of a peek at the other side of the wardrobe, if you know what I mean. I
Yeah.
loved seeing that, we lived in this remote village, and I loved seeing that there were these 10-year-old boys who would read these books and do their things and then go outside and play with sticks and run around barefoot all day. And I just thought that feels like as it should.
Yeah.
So it was something, it was kind of just tapping me a little bit. So met Kyle, got married, had our first baby. We went overseas to Turkey. In Turkey, it was pretty decidedly sure that we would be homeschooling when we lived there, just because of things. I mean, if at minimum, just red tape. So I just decided to go full in on learning about homeschooling as best I could. I grew up with a bit of I don't want to say prejudice, but just assumption about homeschooling. This was the 90s. And I think I just thought things that turned out to be completely untrue. But at the time, there was also just, it wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now either. So give myself grace there. So I was learning to shed those assumptions, those stereotypes, all those things. And I really fell down a rabbit hole by reading good blogs. This was 2005, 6, right when blogs were really taking off. And so I decided if I'm going to homeschool, I'm going to do it well. And I really was drawn to a style that used literature as its spine. I didn't really call it classical yet, but I was drawn to, I don't know if you've ever heard of 5 in a row. Is that still a thing among early educators?
It might be, but
Okay.
I'm not familiar with it.
5 in a row is a big thing at the time, where you take a work of children's literature and you read it 5 times in a row, and you um, use it as the springboard for math, for science, for history, for grammar, for all these subjects, one a day using book, and that was just, honestly, it was a practical thing. It was helpful because we didn't have to bring a lot of curriculum. We didn't, we were living out of suitcases in many ways. And so one thing led to another. It really opened the door to the idea of classical education. And I'm trying to remember exactly what was the thing, other than perhaps meeting just certain people at the right time. I was also starting to blog. And when I started, the easy way to say it was the right time, right place. It was just that season when blogs were becoming everywhere, but and finding their audience. And I became friends with certain people. The one that comes to mind is Sarah McKenzie, who she and I are very good friends now.
Cool.
And it just became, kind of one of the shared knowledge things where you're finding out, okay, what are you doing? You're doing this too. Okay. Kind of worlds. And so it was through these like one step after another that I became familiar with Circe. I became familiar with what it meant to really use literature as the framework for all things, and that's what introduced me to the idea of the canon. And one thing led to another, to where now I've fully drunk the Kool-Aid, and I can't imagine going back. And I've got one in college, so I can attest, even though we didn't do it perfectly, because nobody can, that it does kind of sort of work, meaning she's got her head on her shoulders. And I've got two more that we're still doing the homeschool thing with the classical framework in mind.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I love it. I had a great interview with Bethany Douglas in season 2, and it was really encouraging to hear that moms did not have it all figured out at the start, particularly starting in like 2005, 2006, when resources were not abundant like they are right now. You can't just hop on Instagram and see all these different options laid before you and images. And just this step led to this, and I kept pursuing this good thing or this true thing, and I slowly found my way into this world, and here it is.
Yeah.
And I think that's
Yeah.
really encouraging for particularly
Yeah.
I have a lot of new to homeschooling moms. And so we don't have everything figured out. We are very much learning the philosophy as we have kids underfoot and at the table for the first couple of years. And it's just always encouraging to hear other moms who
100%. Yep, 100%. And that's always encouraging to me too, that even these moms that have younger kids, you guys, even though you have more resources, it doesn't mean exactly that, you're not still having to learn as you go. I think no matter what. I mean, honestly, that makes for the best kind of learning anyway, learning alongside your kids. So,
True.
yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I believe that. I think that's like a homeschool mom anthem. It has to be when
Yeah,
you're learning so much alongside of them. Okay, I
totally.
love this. So you've already hit on one of the things that I really respect and love about your work, which is telos. So initially, when I first started to listen to you, I realized that you had this deep commitment to live within the boundaries of a person's telos and not just up in your ideas and kind of philosophizing about it, but actually you practically in the pursuit of what is good, true, and beautiful, what's good for us as persons, you were figuring it out on the day to day. Like, how could this look in the commonplace, the everyday? There was this connection there. And I really love that, particularly because I think right now, whether in education or just general thinking, people are considered brains on sticks, to steal from
Right.
James K. Smith, the phrase that the commonplace listeners are very familiar with because I love it to talk about modern education. And so we kind of think that we engage with the world and understand the world through facts and figures. And that's kind of what we think people need or want. But I really believe, and to your own story here, that we actually engage and understand the world through story. It's the metaphors we make from the ideas we take in. It's how we understand God and what's happening in our lives. And so, if we can tell ourselves a story, which is what we all do as narrative creatures, we can tell ourselves a true, good, and beautiful story, or we can tell ourselves a bad, untrue story. And these have major impacts on our lives, on the day to day, and on the scope of it. And I think when we tell ourselves bad stories, it's because of this telos issue. It's either that we don't know what our telos is, or we're failing to connect it to the everyday. So, Tish, to kick us off here, what is a telos? What am I even talking about when I use this word? It might be unfamiliar for some. And then why is it so foundational to how we understand the everyday?
Yeah, that's a word that gets bounced around a lot, and it's helpful to pause. And I'm a big fan of definitions because, just to make sure we're all on the same page here. A telos, it's a Greek word, and it basically means a chief end or something's purpose. So a thing exists. So, I've got right here my mug, and it's holding tea, and Aristotle would call it good. And the reason it's good is because it's doing its job, right? So the telos of the mug is to hold liquid, and it is doing a good job of fulfilling its telos because it doesn't have cracks in it, or because it's not crumbling in my hand, or because it has a handle and it keeps me from burning my hands. So a telos, everything has a telos, really, and especially those things that are divinely made. And for those of us who are human beings, we have a divinely appointed telos. And we forget because we're products of the Enlightenment, and we can't help it because that's just the water we swim in. We forget that we are not brains on sticks. I do. I forget all the time. And in fact, I would say I lived my high school life, college, early parenting with this mindset unintentionally. Had I known, I would have repented and sought the error of my ways. I just simply didn't know. I lived in my head. I was very much, I saw it almost as part of my identity. This idea of thinking well, of knowing things in the right way, and knowing the right amount of things, and knowing things in a way that could speak to the right people in the right kind of ways. But at some point, and honestly, it has to do with living overseas, and it has to do with God using that to reframe a lot of my worldview when it comes to the big scope of human history. Where we lived was the ancient city of Smyrna, where it's featured in the book of Revelations. And so we lived where the church was birthed. We had all 7 churches of Revelation around us. I lived an hour from Ephesus. And it was said under our apartment building there were 20 layers of civilizations below us. So we were living in a place that was so much more a cradle of civilization than anything I was used to in Texas. And just being more aware of that. I remember going to my daughter's 3rd birthday party at a literal McDonald's because these were the options. And across the street was a plaque that memorialized where St. Polycarp was martyred, and it just kind of, there was a sort of, what do you call it? Like, just when it didn't compute, I'm like, here I am at this plastic plaything, and I am standing where the earliest church fathers were forming the institution Christ founded for us to then, live and breathe and have our, move and have our being here on earth. And I'm right here. And things just started breaking away when I realized life is so much more than thinking correctly. We're moving about. We are people that live in a real, tangible world, and it matters what we do. It matters how we behave. It matters how we treat our bodies. It matters, like, what we put on and how we speak and all the things, that we are three-dimensional and then some. And so slowly and slowly over time, I started shedding my ideas. Some of it has to do with a little bit in the way I was raised and the type of church I was raised, to recognize the sacramentality of all things. So to recognize that the human person's telos ultimately is to be a saint, right? It is to become like Christ. At the end of the day, at the end of our life, we want to have said that we chose again and again. A saint is simply someone who says yes to God again and again and again, and they choose to do that every day. And so when we can look at the end of our lives and say, that was my telos, to choose the pursuit of sainthood. And the way we do that is through habit, virtue as a habit. And that just doesn't happen. We don't just decide, today I'm going to fully understand prudence and how it works in my life and be a prudent person. That just doesn't happen. And so that's when we have to recognize the things that God has given us in our lives can be tools to further us in our virtue and our pursuit of a habit of virtue, or it can deter us. And I want to make everything around me a tool used for my chief end, my true telos, which is sainthood. So yeah, that's a little bit of the idea. I know that was a big answer for just a short question.
No, I mean, you can't really touch on telos without getting into big answers. It's kind of
Yeah.
impossible. But it is
Right.
a word, like you said, that's thrown around in the classical world a lot, because we're even asking if our education aims in the right direction. Like, to what end ought we aim? Are we headed there? Because if you don't know where you're trying to get to, you're not going to make any wise decisions about how to get there. You're, like you said, you are not just going to end up becoming like Christ without thought and without without thought. There it is. Without thought and effort, without actual acting on the thought. Because
Yeah.
many young moms will say, yes, I do know I should be patient. And yet then we see that we have to break these things down into habit in order to actually live out patience with young
Yeah.
kids and the many messes and the many interruptions and whatnot.
Yeah.
And I like this because I think that we are, in the classical world, we're pretty comfortable with knowing that we need to be mindful of the things we take in. What are the ideas, the stories, the images? We know we're going to reflect these back. We're going to behold them. We're hopefully going to become like the good ones. We know that, again, we're going to have these metaphors that formed from our moral imagination. That's how we're going to be story formed, understand our world. But the reverse is true too. So it's not just that we have to have these lovely ideas coming in to change then how we act. And we can actually flip it and say we can change how we act, and that will bring our heart along as well. And that's not something that I hear talked about as often, but those who are in particular church traditions or denominations will be like, oh, that's like liturgy. That's kind of like that idea. And so
Yeah.
I would love to think about, when we're telling ourselves these stories, that we can choose these habits, like you're talking about, these practices, in order to bring our hearts along. And I think one of your kind of fun, nerdy things that you really get into are historic church practices and thinking
Mm-hmm.
about them and how they kind of created whole souled people in the Platonic sense, bringing in, because we don't hate the mind, but bringing in the mind, the chest or the spirits, and then the appetite. So let's start with, this is going to be a broad brush, like
Yeah.
generally, how has the church, or how have Christians practiced or understood the idea of, rather, the practices and telos connecting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you already hint on the idea of liturgy. So liturgy really means the work of the people, right? So it is the way the common people engage in and participate in worship. It's also important actually to define the idea of worship,
Sure.
because I think in our 2024 mind of going to church, quote, in America especially, we think of it almost as something passive, like we go to a worship service. And so there are ways in which we can attend a church service and say that we worshiped, but did we worship? What is
Mhm.
worship? Worship is a form of justice, right? It is rendering that which is due to God. And so when we worship, we are actually giving God his rightful due. And that involves us showing up. It involves us participating, and it always has from the beginning of time. So Christ, when he instituted the church, he instituted it in a Jewish culture. Jewish culture was full of rituals and customs. So it would only make natural sense for the earliest church to form its own rituals and customs in tandem or, inspired by their Jewish heritage, even take some of that and continue on and reframe it with the idea of Christ being the Messiah who has redeemed them, and incorporate their own. And we see it throughout church history as the church spreads. In the 400s, when St. Patrick goes to Ireland, he takes ideas from the Celts and he incorporates them into the life of the church and makes it part of their liturgy, part of how they pray, part of how they recognize who God is. That's why you see on the Celtic crosses the picture of the sun around the center of the cross, because they worshiped the sun, the Celts. And so St. Patrick said, let's work with that, right? Let's talk about the creator of the sun, the actual sun. So liturgy involves involves us being co-creators. It involves us saying things. It involves us kneeling. It involves us being in communion. It's not a thing we do at home in our own little private living rooms. It involves every part of us. And so whenever we think of telos informing our worship, it really has to do with thinking about the chief end of worship, which is giving God his rightful due, and that we need to be people who worship because we are made for that. And to not do that is to deny part of our humanity. So I show up to worship, and because I am a silly human being, I'm very frail, I need to participate. I need to tell my body to kneel. I need to tell my body to repeat this prayer. And, I like Justin Whitmore Early. He has a simple phrase that says, you say your prayers until your prayers say you. So that's sort of the idea of having memorized prayers that you take from your ancestries, your brothers and sisters of church history, and incorporate their prayers into your life, not because you are holy and not because you fully live out this thing that you are praying, but because you can at least see the glimmer of truth in it. And you can say, yes, I agree with that. I don't live that out yet. I want to live it out. So I'm going to pray and trust that God will use this as part of my worship, and therefore part of my habit formation toward virtue. And so the telos of worship is to make us fully who we're meant to be. And that is a saint. Saint Irenaeus says the glory of God is a human being fully alive, is man fully alive. And that's part of that when we fully end our lives, that we became fully alive more than we are now.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think I love what you said about how we are worshipers. I think that is something that we have to shift post enlightenment. We have to understand that we do not primarily orient in the world with our minds, even though it feels like we should, because we spend so much time, especially if you came up through public school like we did, like, I need to learn these things, I need to put them back on my test, and that means I've accomplished something here and I can go on, I'm going to become a person. But we're only touching one part. And what I've found really interesting lately, I've been really into the medievals. They're just fascinating to me. And I'm reading Winters of the World or In the World by Eleanor Parker. I just started it, but it looks at the Anglo-Saxon calendar. And she's kind of talking about the medieval model of as the church was spreading, they would come into pagan areas and be like, okay, what do they have going on here? Because people are naturally worshipers. They're
Yep.
going to form these habits. They're going to have practices in order to, as they did at this point, understand the world, understand the seasons, the agricultural seasons, the needs they had, familial things, relationship things. And then what could the church use to help those practices become something they could then understand the actual story that was going on
Yeah.
around them. And this was just like the medieval plan. This was the team plan. Wherever you went, this is what you're going to do. And it's been really fascinating to look at this because it shows, one, all people are worshipers. We're going to find something to love. That's our primary orientation. And if your telos is off, there goes your story. So when we think again about what is the chief end of man, this is where I want to head. The story you tell yourself on the day-to-day basis, like, well, no one notices me. They don't see what I do. Da 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 da. That story can shift into, I'm serving Christ when I serve the least of these. I'm doing these things. And the story starts to shift to a truer story, a good story, a beautiful tune. You're looking for that melody. And I think all of these things come to play. And I know your particular fun, nerdy spin is the historic church practices, which we're going to talk about even more. But I've been wanting to know if it was your study of church history that sparked your interest in practices, or did they come from another avenue?
It was honestly almost the other way around. I felt
Okay.
this void in my my worship, nothing felt quite right. It felt like whenever I was going to church in the tradition that I was raised in, it always just kind of felt like I'm putting on a sweater that was too itchy or it didn't quite fit right. So I would go and I would participate, but it just didn't seem like it was really getting at the heart of what it is we're supposed to do when we worship. It felt very passive. It felt very, I mean, this sounds harsh and I don't mean it like this, but this was the type of church we briefly went to. Kyle, my husband, and I would drive home and say it felt like going to a rock concert followed by a TED talk. Like that was the model of church. And we are like, this isn't right. This isn't it. This isn't actually worship.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I had always loved history and I was always, fascinated with it and thinking in terms of history. Like I didn't even know until well into my marriage that not everyone thought of like, what would our past, what would our founding fathers think of this that I'm looking around today? My husband would be like, you think that? You wonder what George Washington would think right now? It's like,
Isn't
yeah.
everyone thinking
You
that?
know that thing that went around recently about men always thinking about the Roman Empire?
Yes, I
Uh,
do.
I was like, what do you mean, men? I think about the Roman Empire all the time. Holy, yeah. And then I realized, like, oh, I am strange. Okay. Anyway,
Yeah. You're not,
but
there's that moment I feel like adults start to realize, oh, not everyone thinks like me. Because
right,
as a child, you just assume everyone's thinking the things you're thinking, but no, this is not true, except for us.
right, exactly. Well, and so, but I will say that also tinted my view of parenting in a way that was probably unhealthy. This is
Mm,
back when my kids were, I don't know, 8 and under, 6 and under, where I was really, the thing that was going around a lot was this idea of living a big story. You hear that all everywhere. New books were being published, especially in the Christian subculture, about like live a big story, do big things for God, make a big splash and big change in the world. And of course, when you are changing diapers and teaching someone how to read at home, that does not feel like living a big story at all.
mhm,
And so I would say that messed with my head. That took me for a tailspin in terms of telos as well, like what is the point of all this? And it kind of led me to, I wouldn't call it a burnout, but it led me to a malaise, kind of an acedia of, so I'm going to wake up and do this again. Okay.
mhm,
I don't really see the chief end. I mean, the chief end was honestly so that we could get to some place better, so that my kids could read on their own, so that therefore I could just give them a book and that could be school, or whatever it is, fill in the blank, and didn't really see the steps as part of my own virtue formation. I'm
mhm.
actually reading right now The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence. It was a reread. I read it in high school, but it did not hit me the way it does in my adulthood years now. But he speaks loud and clear about this. He is a monk assigned to kitchen duty, and he is talking about stirring soup for the glory of God.
Mhm,
And the book is more highlightable. Like it's almost like you need to highlight the parts that aren't noteworthy. The whole book is so great.
mhm,
But to me, it is such a great read for mothers. It's a small book who full of wisdom from a barely literate monk who just wanted to love God by serving. And that's what we largely do. A lot of our days, 99% of our days are just the ordinary soup stirring stuff, right? And so to have the right telos changes everything about that. It determines our everything, our way of looking at it, our worldview, our disposition, our
mhm.
desire to wake up and do it again and again. Our fight against acedia, all the things.
Yeah, that's really great. I'm thinking about As Kingfishers Catch Fire, which is a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins that I really love. I've actually opened the podcast with it before, so hopefully listeners will have remembered that episode in season 1. But in it, each thing is doing the thing it's supposed to be doing. And so
Yeah.
then, of course, you work your way into man, and he is the image of Christ, reflected back to the Father in his face. But there's this wholeness to the poem. Like everything is doing what it ought to be doing, what it was made to do. And isn't that us fully alive, like doing the thing? I'm
Mhm.
actually thinking about Joel Salatin and the Pigness of Pigs, like the marvelous Pigness of Pigs. Like
Yes.
a pig happy should be like this. The same is true for us. Like, what is our telos? And then learning to actually submit to it. Because in the modern world, we have a lot of other answers for what is the chief end. And often they stretch us beyond and outside of the natural path to saying yes to God in these things like stirring soup or changing diapers, whatever it is. So you actually touched on this also as well. A lot of pushback that I get to something like this, like intentionally choosing my practices, or maybe working for practices. They're not things I'm naturally feeling in my heart, but I'm going to choose to do them, is that they are rote, they are empty, they are possibly boring, right? These are the
Yeah.
things I often hear. But when you talk about practices and when you show what they could look like in your work, there's this depth to them. There's like this transcendence, and it feels more like an inheritance, like a gift to us. Like you said, like learning to your Justin's quote, learning the prayers that have stood the test of time. They've been with people during wartime and famine and loss and lack, and we have
Yeah.
these to inherit and start to
Yeah.
also pray. These sorts of things. So you share about them in such a beautiful way. They can never feel empty and rote to me, even though oftentimes my feelings are not coming along with me in the moment. And so, what is your encouragement to the person who kind of looks at you and is like, "Yeah, I'm not feeling it, so I don't really want to have to go do it until I feel like doing it," because I think that's a common place people find themselves in. We're kind of fickle.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I would say is me too. I mean,
Yeah.
I know it sounds like I'm thinking correctly and I have all the boundless energy in the world to think this way, but it really and truly I don't. I wake up at about 5 in the morning because my body decides it's time to wake up. And I spend the first 30 minutes of the morning just choosing to be a person. I start my day with my gratitude list, and I am doing it because I know it's good for me, not because I feel especially grateful. I am doing it when I get the coffee ready. I'm doing it, I'm doing my other things. I'm reading my Bible because it's the next page to read, not because I can't wait to find the insightful epiphany that I'm going to need to carry me through the day. No, it's the doing of the things. I tell my college age daughter all the time that motivation comes after action. It's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking. Wait, am I saying this right? It's easier
Mhm.
to, yes, act your way into a
Yeah.
new way of thinking than to think your way into a new way of acting,
Yeah.
right? If we wait till we think correctly in order to act as we ought, we are going to be thinking a very long time, right? Because we are fickle and silly, right? And so I'm not going to feel like working out most of the time.
Mhm.
I do it because I know I ought to, because I want to treat my body with dignity the way God entrusted me to do so. So I'm doing a lot of these things because it is good for me. It is the vitamin I need. And the delightful, because God is good, the delightful effect is that I end up often wanting it anyway.
Mhm.
So I would read books that felt hard because I knew it was good for me, but it turns out 10, 20 years later, when I go to the shelf and I pull off a book, I am going to kind of want to read the books that I would think back in high school, like, oh no, that's an assignment. But
Mhm.
turns out I actually want to read them. But that takes time. That takes practice. That takes just showing up again and again and doing it and not waiting till you feel like it. Because you're not gonna, even when you feel like doing a lot of things, you're not going to want to feel like doing all the things. That's
Mhm.
why the pursuit of a habit of virtue is lifelong.
Yeah.
We need habits as the guardrails. We don't need a habit to breathe because we
Right.
just do. But we
Mhm.
need habits for the things that we don't want to do naturally or aren't good at doing naturally. So, yeah, welcome to being human is what I would say in all love, because I'm right there with you.
Really. Right.
Yeah.
I remember when I first started to get in classical ed and I was reading a lot about virtue and thinking about it, I was sorely disappointed to find out that to have a virtuous character, it didn't have to feel like work anymore. Like the habit should have become like breathing. I was like, well, this is unfortunate for me because I've not made much progress because I feel like I'm having to work quite hard on these things. But
Yeah.
that's ultimately kind of the thing we're hoping to give our kids with this sort of
Yeah.
upbringing. And in, Mason speak, habits, the instrument of discipline is not the only thing. Don't make a fetish out of it, she says. But as an instrument in kind of the almost the Trinitarian form of the three, is that you are hopefully setting up your child to a norm of what is good, what is true, what
Yeah.
is beautiful. And like you said, it's a lifelong pursuit. They're going to have to eventually assume responsibility for this, and that will grow and
Yeah.
grow as they grow. And then they'll be out and they'll have all the freedom to decide. But while they're in your home, what we're hoping to do is set them up so that when they deviate from what is the norm, the good life, the actual telos good life, they will feel it. It will feel uncomfortable. And it's almost like they just kind of pop back on. This is what we do. We seek forgiveness when we sin against a sibling. This is our norm. And you just keep going because it's not virtue
Mhm.
if it lives in your head and doesn't come out of your body, and it's not virtue if you're still having to force yourself to do it. And so that's kind of that habit getting working there. So would love to talk about two specific practices, of which you have spent a lot of time studying and working on resources for, and of which I have purchased and used, and I love both of them. So I think one of your superpowers for real is being able to see a principle or a living idea in something old and historic, and then bringing it into the modern world. Because I think there's always a temptation to find something old and be like, I'll just copy and paste it. Charlotte Mason said exactly this. I'm going to make it work for me, even though it's not 1890. And it doesn't
Right.
work that way. Like being able to take an eternal principle or a living idea and apply it to ever changing circumstances is kind of a riff definition on prudence, but it's also a unique gift. And I think that's why your resources are so helpful. And I think right now we need help from the past, from learning what has been proved to be a faithful path in this direction of our telos. So two resources. One is the monastic rule of life, of which you have a rule of life course. And if I didn't say it already, I will put all this in the episode notes today so you can find all these things.
Okay.
But I took that course. It was gifted to me by my husband in early 2022, and the time to complete it. It was amazing. It was my birthday gift. And then the second is the Daily Examine, of which you have a new book, First Light and Eventide. So before we launch into these, I do want to say that I am not Catholic, and I have benefited greatly from these two practices, which are very deep and steep in the Catholic history. So if the practice aims at the right telos, it's good for persons. And so in
Mm-hmm.
case these are new things to you and you're like, well, this isn't my jam, just listen. And I think you will find that they are for all persons. Also, like
Yep.
your brother-in-law might like the rule of life. So I know we have a lot of homeschool moms here, but these are really for persons. So for the first
That's
one,
right.
the monastic rule of life. What is it, and why is it so helpful for modern women and they're telling a story to themselves?
Yeah, so Saint Benedict basically is a father of Western monasticism because he was the first one to think through what does it look like to live in community with other people with intention. He wrote the Rule of Life that we still use largely as a framework today, and all Benedictine communities still use this literal rule of life. It's obviously, it's from the 500s, so it's specific to their time and place and their type of community, but the framework is a blueprint for us that we can use to this day. And it is both kind of a why and a how. So in his rule of life, he gets really specific. It's almost funny because he will get into the, why it is good to pray first thing in the morning and why it's good to wake up with the sun. And so therefore you're sleeping more in the winter and sleeping less in the summer. And he gets into the theological ramifications of that, all the way to like whenever you are assigned the duty to check people in at the, it's very administrative as well. And so to me, it's kind of a blessing in that sense because that's what we do in our domestic monasteries too, right? We are running a household. We are running a community of people. We are rubbing shoulders with other people who are, made in the image of God, yet are also mortals and fallen people. And so what does it look like for us to live in community and to point each other to virtue? That is what a good rule of life does. The short definition of a rule of life is a commitment to live your life in a particular way. And so, yes, you could just decide right now on a napkin to just jot down, these are the things that matter to me, and this is going to be my commitment. And my rule comes from the Latin word regula, which is also obviously where we get the word ruler. And if you think of it as a straight line, so it's almost like an ideal version of our life. Not that whenever we free write it, we're going to be able to get it as straight as if we used a ruler, but we at least know what we aim toward. And so writing a rule gives us a straight line. Benedict used a framework, we can extract the framework where he hit on 5 habit practices involving work, study, worship, hospitality, and renewal. And so creating a rule if you want to kind of make it as full as maybe you would want to hit all the dimensions of your life, it's good to touch on those 5 things. I find it's helpful to write in the present tense as though this is true in your life, not to shame you or not to feel like, gosh, I do not live up to this, but in some ways to recognize I don't yet live up to this, but I want to. And it is, in some ways, you could call it a manifesto, but it's a little bit more of just, this is what I'm aiming for. And so, just to give a quick example, under my category of work or vocation, I talk about how I am first a wife and mom, and everything aims to that, including my writing. And then when I get to my writing, I will say things like, I I prioritize something that lasts over ephemera when it comes to writing. So that means it then determines a lot of my daily choices. So I, as a writer, am going to spend more time writing essays, writing books than I am Instagram captions, because that's my priority. That's what I see as a time tested practice that will stick around, things like that. And so you work through all these categories. You ask yourself questions. You do it in tandem with your spouse if you want, and you create a working rule of life. It is a living document. It is not chiseled in stone like like it's some sort of thing to idolize. It's not your slave master. It works for you. And so, in fact, I just did your 2024 literary life planner, and you
Okay.
had such a good phrase that I highlighted several times, that it's not a blood oath, I think is what you said. I
I was
loved
not a blood.
that so much.
Yeah.
Yes, however
Yeah.
you said it. I thought that was exact. I was like, that's like a rule. I revisit my rule twice a year, on my birthday and on the a calendar new year, because things change. Things will tweak. My rule looked different when I was parenting younger kids. Now that I'm parenting older kids, it will just look different. So it's a living document that helps you know your straight line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I, as someone who went through it and took the whole course and have revisited my rule about every 6 months, because I remember you making that note, that's how often you did it. I was like, oh, that's good to do. I found that while aiming towards the ideal, is not is not your idealized self. So I think with goal making, a lot of times, particularly at the beginning of the new year, we visualize our ideal self. We're going to run 7 miles every morning, and also we're going to do this, and then the kids will wake up, and we make this very perfected version of us. Where when you lead through the rule of life, there are questions about. I know you've revamped it, but I think it was like 3 years out was kind of the
Yeah,
timeline. So you could
yeah,
still you could actually reasonably think ahead 3 years. You weren't trying to guess 15 years from now, but it wasn't so close that it was a year and you couldn't make too much progress. In each thing you kind of asked or you worked through, there was a well, why? Well,
yeah,
why? And I love that because again, you took these big ideas and then you got down to like the nugget living idea, which is the principle
yeah.
that you're actually asking, does this aim towards my chief
Hmm.
end? Will this
Yeah,
actually push me a little bit more in that direction? And then you came up with these really freeing, or at least as I worked through it, I came up with these really freeing things. So my example I like to give people when I talk about role of life is that you can't say I'm going to get 8 hours of sleep a night. That's one of those things that will crumble because you can't demand that sort of thing as a wife and mom if you have young kids, particularly in the season I'm in. But instead, you can do something like I will be in bed by 10 p.m. as best
yeah,
you can, and
yeah,
then maybe you don't get the sleep, maybe you do, but the habit you are forming is caring for your body, that you need rest. And in 3 years, hopefully you will not be on the edge of an autoimmune disorder or just overworked and burnt out because you never sleep. You've made this habit of I'm caring for my body. And then of course you go through all these different categories, but I loved it because it gave a very large philosophical start, and then you got down into that practical. And one thing
yeah.
that's great just for moms, as you get asked to do things or kids have opportunities to do things, you can revisit that rule and you're like,
Hmm.
actually, I'm not going to take on this work project. It doesn't fit this priority. I don't have time for it. Or no, our family really prioritizes dinner time every night. It's a thing we talked about, eating communally every night at the table. We can't do that then. And it just kind
Yeah,
of helps give you what I call pegs, you're calling boundaries, so that you're able to pursue this right telos and hopefully build out a story that is true for your family. So I
yeah.
loved the rule of life. I'm always telling people they need to do it. It's one that I think everyone needs to do. Now, the second one, I know that the book, again, First Light and Eventide, is kind of based on the idea of daily examine. But I think another way,
Hmm.
with the way you've worked at it, could be like daily contemplation, reflection, and gratitude, possibly, because
Yeah.
I know it's kind of a spin. So if you could talk to us a little bit about either the examine or what you did with the new book, and then why this is also important.
Yeah. So the practice of examine comes from the 1500s from St. Ignatius of Loyola. He was another community founder, a monastic. He founded the Jesuits, and he was a former soldier. He was in the military before he converted. And so he thought of his group of men somewhat militaristically. He thought of it, in a way where it is good to have a lot of discipline, a lot of rules. And so he created a community like that, and he drew people that were drawn to that idea. And so he would have 30-day intensives where men would have to really wrestle with who they are and what they're doing, why they're drawn to this, and whether they really want to stick around. Once they went through that, then he had all his men practice what was called an examen every single day. And what this looked like, this was in the evening, And it was covering 5 things. And I don't quite remember all the 5 things off the top of my head, but basically it was looking back on your day. And we're just talking the past 24 hours because you're doing this every night, looking from the past day and noticing where God showed up. So you're looking and you're saying God was there, God was there. And then you go back and you recognize when you realized that, or when you affirmed that in the here and now, and you thank God for that. You recognize when you completely missed the mark, when you did not notice God, or when you chose to ignore God, and you repent of that. You make a commitment to do it again, or, to do better the next day, rinse and repeat kind of idea. A colloquial term for examine is backwards prayer, because what you're doing is you're recognizing where God already was. You're not asking God to be in the future. I mean, that's perhaps sort of implied, but you're recognizing how God was at work in your day all day long. So to me, this was a great natural practice for us in the here and now, because we need to stop all the time. I need to stop all the time and remember that God is at work. I forget far too often when I'm in the midst of things. And so examine became a practice for me to end my day. But then I recognized that I also wanted a little bit of something similar in the morning. I'm more of a morning person anyway. I'm just naturally more coherent than in the evening. I'm kind of just toast. So I started doing a form of examine in the morning that kind of morphed into a form of gratitude, honestly, because that's kind of the natural byproduct of recognizing where God's showing up in your life all the time, right? And so I started a practice of morning gratitude. Again, like I said earlier, it's not because I feel super grateful the first thing when I wake up, but I recognize now, because this is such a habit, that there is stuff everywhere, all over, inside out, that I can be grateful for. One of the little tips and tricks I have learned over the years of doing this is to get really granular, really specific in your gratitude, because I make the practice of writing down 3 things I'm grateful for in the morning and 3 things in the evening. So that's 6 things a day. You do that every single day, and you kind of start thinking, I'm going to run out of things to be grateful for. I can only say coffee and my kids so many times, right? But when you start doing things like this particular roast of coffee, the mug that my coffee is in, the fact that my husband ground the coffee last night before we went to bed, some form of when you can get really specific, you recognize God's grandeur is everywhere, right? And you can't, when you put on those lenses, you can't unsee it. And so cultivating that habit practice and not waiting till you feel like it means over time, those lenses stay on throughout the day, even when you're not meaning to. You start noticing the things. And so I have my kids do that. That's how we start every school day. We pray, we do gratitude, and then we go around, we say what we're grateful for. It's sometimes very funny, but it's important that we have to start, even when somebody is in the absolute worst mood and they cannot believe they have to be a person today. They still, it might be my kids are thankful for glass and thankful for, they look around the room, but it's like, no, that counts, that works. The invention of fill in the blank, whatever. And so my practice of examine largely incorporates gratitude, but it also from there incorporates the idea of naming true things, because we believe we have to fight untrue things all day long, about ourselves, about the world, about our children, about everything, right? And so it's good to arm ourselves, to equip ourselves with true things. And so the next thing I do in the morning is name one true thing about myself or about God. And then what is one thing within my control, or within my free will, that could make the day a better one. So the example, when I was teaching at a co-op, I would tell the kids, it's not that Mrs. Smith would cancel the math test, because that's out of your control. It's that I would diligently study and give God honor by making good use of my time and my resources through my pursuit of studying algebra, that kind of thing. That's what you are pursuing. So that's the morning. In the evening, you recognize where things didn't go as you should, and that's okay. And the reason that's there is because we need to remember how we are not God. God is God and we are not. I need that reminder too. And that makes me more and more dependent on him. And then one more way that we would love God to show up the next day. So those are the 3 things, 3 in the morning, 3 in the evening, that have become my modern day, maternal in some ways examine.
They're very helpful, particularly the reflection back on the day of like, what did it go well? Often would help me on the next day of like, what's in my control. They would kind of end up
Hmm.
being linked, particularly if I
Yeah.
kept seeing like a pattern, like some sort of bad habit. Then I could start with before the kids started or before the day started with that, what's in my control. And it just seemed to be like stuck in my mind because I took it
Yeah.
into the day and I was like, this is very focused. I really want to do this today. And I also found that with this kind of 3 and 3, you have the habits of attention, and that really comes to play. Like you do start to notice things, like you were saying, as you get more specific, you're realizing all around you are the fingerprints of God. Like he's clearly very merciful and kind to you, but it'd be so easy to miss them because I mean, we just get our food at the store. We don't have to hope it rains. We don't need to pray about that. Like we
Right.
miss all these things that historically have tied people to God's work in their lives that we can kind of forget. And so I think noticing these things teaches such a strong habit of attention, which is absolutely necessary to pray, to
Yeah.
worship, to see the sacramental world, all these things. And having this daily practice is really helpful. I know also for those who are a little bit like me and they struggle if they can't fill in every page on the day they were supposed to, they forgot the evening. One thing that I noticed is just because it's a small, like a small time amount for me for a habit, but then it was like, even if I forgot the page, my mind in the evening, as I was going to bed, would start thinking like, well, what were my 3 things? Like it would just
Yeah.
kind of start running the track, even though the book wasn't in my hands that night because I never
Yep.
got to it, which I thought was really lovely because the practice was being embedded. Because that's one thing about practices is you literally write them into your body and your neural pathways. Like they really
Yeah.
do become a part of you. And so then they kind of start going on that course. And isn't that great to have one of gratitude
Yeah.
in particular? I think both books are lovely. I actually talked about your book in my self-care YouTube video, and I don't ever have like a script or an outline for videos. And so I watched back on that video and realized I just kept talking about how beautiful it was because I really don't like how ugly things are marketed to women. And so if you've not looked at Tish's book, I'm going to say it again. It's very beautiful. The colors are
Yeah.
not offensive. The fonts are not childish. It's just a very
No,
lovely, beautiful thing because beauty matters and matter matters. And so if you
I
want to,
agree.
yeah, I know because you made this beautiful book, but if you want to think about what kind of true things can you bring into the story you're telling yourself about God in your life, the gratitude question you ask, like what's one true thing about me or God, is an excellent way to start working on that story piece
Yeah.
as well. So
And and I think you hit on something really good whenever you mention that you don't always get to every page. I don't either. And
yeah.
that's because the book is not the boss of me. These practices, these habit practices of examine, of creating a rule, they are meant to serve you, not the other way around. And so it's helpful to keep it in that, in that realm, that these are for our virtue formation, but they are not meant to chastise us or make us feel like we're not measuring up or, giving us one more thing to do. That's actually
Mhm.
a common concern many women have, is like, well, my plate is already full. How can I add one more practice into my life? Well, that's not what this is. This is not one more thing to do. This is a way to frame your thinking and your being, and giving you a perspective shift on your telos throughout your day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, Tish, thank you so much for coming on today. As we send you off here, I would love to know where, or tell everyone else, I know where I can find you. Where can we find you online? And do you have any exciting projects you are currently working on?
TshOxenreider.com is the easiest place to find everything because that's where all the links are. In particular, my Substack is where I like to interact with people the most. I have a podcast and other such lovely things as well. But just go to that place and you'll see all my things. Right now, I am working on a book. I'm working on 2 books, actually, a nonfiction work and a fiction work. I've long been wanting to move into fiction. And so it's been a long project. And so those are the 2 main things on my plate, along with, being a mom. So in the nooks and crannies of my time, I'm writing, and that's my favorite thing to do. So I'm very blessed and grateful to be able to do it.
Wonderful. Do you have expected release dates for those? Yeah.
um,
I don't know how that
no.
works. Okay.
No, I would like to see them done. I would like to see the manuscripts done sometime this next year.
Okay, cool.
Whether that turns into a published book on X date, who knows? If it's kind of out of my hands. But those are the 2 big projects on my plate. So I would love to see them turn into something for other readers, because that's why I write, not just for me.
Yeah. Perfect. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was an absolute pleasure to have you. And everybody else, I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Bye.